There is a quiet decision each of us makes every day, often without realizing it. It's not a goal, it's not a plan, it's not even a belief we argue for. It is an assumption, and that single assumption, held long enough, felt deeply enough, has the power to reorganize your entire world. Most people think reality changes when circumstances change, when the money comes, when the opportunity appears, when someone else finally behaves differently. But reality does not move first. It follows. It follows the position you take within yourself. Here is the one assumption that changes everything. This is already mine. This is already done. This is already true, not as wishful thinking, not as blind optimism, but as an inner posture, quiet, settled, unquestioned, because life does not respond to what you want, it responds to what you accept as real. Look closely at your everyday experiences. Notice how effortlessly you experience the things you never question. You don't strain to prove the sun will rise. You don't hope your name will still be your name tomorrow. You simply assume, and the world agrees, that same mechanism is at work everywhere else. The difference between those who struggle and those who seem lucky is not talent, effort, or timing. It is the assumption they live from. One assumes life works out for me. Another assumes I must fight for every inch. And reality plays both roles perfectly. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Your world is not a reflection of your desires. It is a mirror of your self-concept. You do not get what you affirm once or visualize occasionally. You get what feels natural to be true about you. That's why forcing change feels exhausting. You're trying to drag reality somewhere your identity hasn't gone yet. But when the assumption shifts, when you internally move into the state of already being, effort becomes unnecessary. Think of it this way. You don't try to act like yourself, you just are. And the moment you assume a new version of yourself, successful, chosen, secure, fulfilled, you stop asking if it will happen. You start moving as though it must. That's when reality catches up, because feeling is the seal, not excitement, not desperation, but calm knowing. The kind that says, of course this works out. Of course I'm supported. Of course I belong here. When that feeling becomes familiar, the world has no choice but to mirror it. Time collapses when inevitability enters the room. People often ask, how long does it take? But time is not the factor. Resistance is. The moment you stop checking for proof, proof begins appearing. The moment you stop asking how, life supplies the route, not because you forced it, but because you assumed the end. This is why persistence matters, not persistence in action, but persistence in inner alignment, returning again and again to the same quiet knowing, refusing to argue with appearances, letting the assumption harden into identity, and once it becomes identity, reality follows automatically. You were never meant to wrestle the world into submission. You were meant to decide who you are and let the world adjust. So choose the assumption wisely. Choose the one that says, I am already enough. I am already chosen. I am already aligned with what I seek. Hold it gently, feel it naturally, live from it consistently, and watch how reality without announcement or struggle rearranges itself around the only thing it has ever obeyed, your assumption, because the moment you change that, everything else must follow. Most people believe reality is something happening to them, as if life were an external force making random decisions. But beneath every visible experience is something quieter and far more powerful at work. Long before events take shape, before circumstances harden into facts, an assumption is already present, unchallenged, accepted, and operating in the background. This assumption does not shout, it does not demand attention, it simply is, and because it is, reality organizes itself around it. An assumption is not a hope or a preference, it is what you take for granted as true, what you assume about yourself, about others, about how life treats you, becomes the invisible framework through which everything flows. You do not need to repeat it aloud, you do not need to defend it. In fact, the strongest. Assumptions are rarely spoken because they feel too obvious to question. They operate like gravity, unseen, unquestioned, yet absolute in their influence. If someone assumes they are always overlooked, life will faithfully provide situations that confirm it. Not because life is cruel, but because it is precise. If another assumes that things tend to work out in their favor, doors open in ways that seem coincidental to outsiders. The world is not reacting to effort or intelligence in these moments, it is responding to an inner stance that has already been accepted as reality. What makes assumption so powerful is its neutrality. Reality does not judge whether an assumption is helpful or harmful. It does not evaluate whether it is fair or logical, it simply mirrors it. The outer world has no choice but to express what the inner world has already agreed upon. Once something is assumed, the mind begins selecting evidence, interpreting events, and guiding behavior in subtle ways that make the assumption appear undeniably true. This is why attempting to change life without changing assumption feels like resistance. You may act against an old pattern, but if the underlying assumption remains untouched, the pattern reasserts itself. The inner agreement is still in place. Life is only honoring the terms you've unconsciously signed. Assumption works because it precedes perception. You do not see first and assume later. You assume first and then see. Experience flows through expectati. On. This is why two people can encounter the same situation and walk away with entirely different realities. Each one filtered the moment through a different assumption of what it meant, what it said about them, and what would follow next. The quiet nature of assumption is what makes it such a powerful architect. It does not need force. It does not need repetition fueled by strain. Once something feels settled, once it feels normal, the world accepts it as instruction. Reality rearranges itself not in response to what you ask for, but in response to what you silently live from. To change reality, then, is not to battle appearances, but to become aware of what you have already decided is true. Because the moment an assumption shifts, the blueprint changes. And when the blueprint changes, the structure that rises from it cannot remain the same. Most people are taught, directly or indirectly, that effort is the price of change, that if something has not yet appeared, it must be chased harder, forced longer, or pursued with greater intensity. But reality does not respond to strain, it responds to inner certainty. The world is not impressed by how much you struggle, it simply reflects how sure you are of what you expect. When something is assumed to be inevitable, behavior naturally aligns without friction. There is no inner argument, no constant checking, no anxious adjustment. Action may still occur, but it feels guided rather than forced. Compare this to effort that comes from action fueled by the fear that nothing will happen unless you push. That kind of effort is loud, exhausting, and rooted in the assumption that the desired outcome is uncertain. Inner certainty is quiet. It does not announce itself. It shows up as calm movement, relaxed timing, and a lack of desperation. When you are certain of an outcome, you stop negotiating with reality. You no longer watch for signs to reassure yourself. You simply proceed as someone for whom the result is already settled. This is why two people can take similar actions and receive entirely different results. One acts from trust, the other from tension. One expects success as a natural extension of who they are, the other hopes success will validate them. Reality responds to the expectation, not the action. The same behavior, when driven by different assumptions, produces different outcomes because the inner position is different. Effort becomes necessary only when certainty is missing. The mind attempts to compensate for doubt through repetition, control, and force. But force is a signal. It signals to the subconscious that the outcome is not yet secure, and what is not assumed to be secure remains unstable in experience. The world reflects that instability by producing delays, resistance, or inconsistent results. When inner certainty is present, effort loses its emotional weight. Actions feel obvious rather than urgent. Decisions are made without overthinking. Timing aligns because there is no internal rush or resistance distorting perception. This is often mistaken for luck, but it is simply coherence between expectation and experience. Reality rearranges itself most efficiently when there is no internal contradiction. When what you expect, feel, and assume all point in the same direction, life moves smoothly. But when effort is driven by anxiety, the inner message conflicts with the outer action. One part of you is saying, this must happen, while another is saying, I'm not sure it will. Reality responds to the deeper message. Certainty does not mean pretending or convincing yourself through forceful affirmation. It is not emotional intensity, it is acceptance. It is the moment something feels settled internally, even before there is visible proof. At that point, effort becomes optional rather than necessary. This is why people often receive breakthroughs when they stop trying so hard, not because they gave up, but because they released the assumption of resistance. They moved from striving to expecting, from hoping to knowing, and reality, always attentive to the inner signal, followed suit. Effort may initiate movement, but certainty determines direction. Without certainty, effort scatters energy. With certainty, even small actions carry disproportionate impact. Reality does not ask how hard you tried, it only asks what you assumed was true. Words are often mistaken for the engine of change, but words alone carry very little power. They are symbols, instructions, or reminders at best. What actually shapes experience is the feeling that accompanies a thought and lingers after the words fade. Feeling is not emotion in its dramatic sense. It is the subtle sense of reality you carry within yourself. It is the inner atmosphere you live in, the mood that colors what feels possible or impossible before you consciously decide. Every experience passes through feeling before it becomes fact. A thought entertained briefly may do nothing, but a thought felt as real leaves an imprint. Feeling is what tells the mind, this is true, or this is just imagination. When something is felt as true, the subconscious accepts it without debate and begins expressing it outwardly. This is why fleeting affirmations rarely change anything, while deeply felt assumptions quietly transform entire lives. Feeling works because it bypasses logic. You do not argue with what you feel, you move from it. If you feel secure, you behave differently than if you feel uncertain. If you feel valued, your posture, tone, and choices shift without conscious effort. These shifts may appear small, but they alter how others respond to you, which in turn reinforces the original feeling. The cycle continues until the feeling solidifies into a lived reality. What you feel consistently becomes familiar, and what is familiar becomes normal. The mind accepts the familiar as truth, regardless of whether it was once imagined or externally confirmed. This is why rehearsing a new feeling internally can feel uncomfortable at first. It contradicts what has been emotionally normalized. But persistence in feeling, not intensity, is what establishes a new baseline. Feeling is the language reality understands because it represents agreement. When you feel something as real, you are no longer asking for it, you are experiencing it internally. The outer world mirrors this internal experience in its own time and form. This is not metaphorical, it is observable in how people naturally align with what they feel to be true about themselves. Opportunities, conversations, and outcomes seem to gravitate toward those inner states. Many people attempt to change feeling by manipulating circumstances, believing that once the external world improves, the internal state will follow. But feeling is causal, not reactive. Waiting for proof before allowing yourself to feel fulfilled, confident, or secure keeps those states perpetually out of reach. The feeling must come first, or the experience has nothing to echo. Feeling does not require visualization or dramatic emotion. It can be as simple as a quiet sense of this fits or this is done. It is the difference between wanting and accepting. Once acceptance occurs, resistance dissolves. The body relaxes, the mind stops checking. The feeling becomes your home. This is why momentary emotional highs do not create lasting change. They fade because they are not internalized, but a gentle, sustained feeling, revisited regularly, reshapes identity. And when identity shifts, reality follows naturally. Life does not respond to what you repeat, it responds to what you feel to be true when no one is watching and nothing is demanding your attention. Most people attempt to change their circumstances while leaving their sense of self untouched. They focus on fixing situations, improving conditions, or convincing others to respond differently, all while carrying the same internal identity into every new attempt. But experience does not originate from circumstances, it flows from the identity that meets them. What you experience, is not determined by what happens, but by who you believe yourself to be while it is happening. Identity is not a label you announce. It is a quiet self definition expressed through expectation. It is the role you assume before evidence appears. If you see yourself as someone who struggles, even success will feel temporary and fragile. If you see yourself as someone who is naturally capable and supported, obstacles will feel like brief interruptions rather than permanent barriers. The same external events pass through different identities and emerge as different realities. This is why waiting for circumstances to validate a new identity rarely works. Confidence does not arrive after success. Success follows the assumption of confidence. Feeling chosen does not come after being selected. Selection mirrors the inner knowing of worth. Identity is the cause, not the result. Until the cause shifts, effects rearrange themselves only temporarily. Every action you take is filtered through identity. Two people may perform identical tasks, but the inner story behind the action determines its impact. One acts as someone proving their value, the other as someone expressing it. One seeks permission, the other expects cooperation. These differences are subtle, yet they shape how the world responds. People, opportunities, and outcomes align with the role you consistently play. Identity operates through what feels natural. You do not question actions that align with who you assume yourself F to be. A person who identifies as confident does not force confidence. They simply speak, move, and decide from that position. Likewise, someone who identifies as undeserving does not need external rejection to feel excluded. They anticipate it, interpret events through it, and unconsciously reinforce it. This is why temporary mindset shifts fade if identity remains unchanged. You can think positive thoughts, set goals, and take action, but if your self concept contradicts the desired outcome, reality will reflect the deeper agreement. Life does not respond to surface level intention, it responds to the identity that intention emerges from. Identity is shaped internally long before it is expressed externally. It forms through repetition of inner conversations, emotional habits, and unchallenged assumptions. Once an identity is accepted, it becomes self sustaining. The world begins providing feedback that appears to confirm it, strengthening the original belief. This feedback loop continues until identity is consciously revised. Revising identity is not about denying the present, it is about choosing the position you occupy internally. The moment you begin to relate to yourself as someone who already embodies the qualities you seek, your relationship with life changes. You stop asking for permission to be who you are. You start moving as if it is expected. Circumstances then become responsive rather than controlling. They rearrange not because you fought them, but because they encountered a different version of you. And that version, assumed first within, becomes the reference point reality must reflect. Time feels like the great obstacle to change, as though reality moves on a fixed schedule that must be endured. People often ask how long something will take, how many steps are required, or what process must unfold before the desired outcome appears. But time is not the true variable. What determines speed is the degree of certainty with which an assumption is held. When something feels inevitable, time loses its power to delay it. Persistence in assumption does not mean repeating words endlessly or forcing belief through strain. It means returning again and again to the same inner conclusion. It is the refusal to mentally abandon an outcome simply because it has not yet appeared. The moment an assumption feels settled, the waiting dissolves. You are no longer counting days or measuring progress because internally the matter is already closed. Time stretches when doubt is present. Every moment of questioning reopens the decision. Each glance at appearances that contradict the assumption reinforces the sense that the outcome is still uncertain. This internal back and forth keeps the experience suspended, not because reality is resisting, but because the assumption has not yet stabilized. When an assumption is persisted in calmly, without emotional struggle, it becomes familiar. Familiarity removes urgency. Urgency dissolves resistance. Once resistance fades, experience reorganizes rapidly. What once seemed distant begins to converge through unexpected channels, sudden shifts, or sequences that appear perfectly timed. To the mind, it looks like acceleration. Internally, it feels like alignment. This is why people sometimes experience dramatic change after long periods of apparent stagnation. It is not that reality suddenly decided to cooperate. It is that the inner decision finally solidified. The assumption crossed from hopeful to accepted. Once that happened, time could no longer act as a buffer. Persistence is not about never having a contradictory thought. It is about where you return after the thought passes. The dominant assumption is the one you live from, not the one you occasionally entertain. Each return strengthens it. Each return tells the subconscious this is still true. Over time, that truth hardens into expectation. Expectation collapses time because it removes anticipation. You do not anticipate what you expect, you simply proceed. And when anticipation disappears, behavior, perception, and opportunity align effortlessly. You notice what you previously overlooked. You respond differently. Others respond differently to you. Events line up not because they were forced, but because the internal state that delayed them has dissolved. Time is experienced subjectively. Moments feel long when filled with resistance and short when filled with certainty. This subjective experience translates outwardly. When the inner experience becomes one of completion rather than waiting, outer completion follows naturally. Reality echoes the internal sense of already done. With external confirmation, the world does not measure time the way the mind does. It responds to stability. When an assumption stabilizes, expression follows. What seems like delay is simply the interval required for certainty to replace doubt. Once that transition occurs, the effect feels immediate. Persistence, then, is not about endurance. It is about loyalty to an inner conclusion. The moment you stop revisiting the question of whether it will happen, time loses its role, and what once felt far away steps forward as though it had been waiting for that very decision. Most people try to change the world by pushing against it. They argue with circumstances, resist conditions, and attempt to overpower situations through will and effort. This creates the sense that life is something to be battled rather than something that responds. But struggle is not a requirement for change. In fact, force is often the very thing that maintains the conditions one is trying to escape. Reality does not transform through pressure, it transforms through position. When the inner position changes, the outer world adjusts without confrontation. This adjustment is subtle at first. Situations that once provoked anxiety lose their emotional charge. People who once seemed obstructive soften or drift away. Opportunities appear without being hunted. None of this happens because reality was convinced, but because it encountered a different internal stance. Force implies opposition. It assumes something is wrong and must be corrected. This assumption itself reinforces resistance. When you internally accept a new state as natural, there is nothing to fight. You are no longer trying to make something happen. You are allowing what is already assumed to express itself. The absence of struggle is not passivity, it is alignment. Changing an assumption does not require confronting every external detail. You do not need to fix the past or control others. Assumptions operate beneath the surface, influencing perception and reaction. When perception changes, reaction changes. When reaction changes, outcomes change. The chain is effortless because it follows the path of least resistance. This is why inner shifts often lead to external changes that feel disproportionate to the effort involved. A single internal decision can alter patterns that seemed deeply entrenched. The mind interprets this as coincidence or luck, but it is simply coherence restoring itself. Reality prefers harmony between inner expectation and outer experience. When force is removed, timing improves. Conversations happen naturally. Decisions are made without hesitation. You stop pushing in directions that no longer match your inner state. This alone eliminates many obstacles that were self-created through tension and impatience. What remains aligns smoothly. Others respond to inner shifts instinctively. They sense confidence, calm, or certainty without needing explanation. This changes how they interact, what tea they offer, and what they withhold. The world is relational, and relationships adjust automatically when one side changes its position. There is no need for persuasion when alignment is present. Effort becomes counterproductive once the assumption has changed. Continuing to push suggests that the old belief is still active. Allowing space signals trust. Trust invites confirmation. This is why letting go often produces faster results than trying harder. Letting go is not abandonment of desire, it is the release of resistance. Reality is fluid. It rearranges itself constantly around the strongest, most consistent inner signals. When those signals shift, the arrangement follows. There's no drama in this process, no announcement, just quiet reconfiguration. What once required effort no longer does because the inner contradiction has been resolved. You are no longer pulling against yourself. The world reflects that unity. Change happens not because you demanded it, but because you no longer need it to.